Thank you for coming, and a warm welcome to everyone who's tuning in online. My name is Dorota Głowacka. I'm a professor here at King's in the Contemporary Studies program. I'm the co-organizer of this lecture series on representations of disability in historical, scientific, and artistic perspectives, together with my colleague and friend, Sue Dodd. And before I begin, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge that this event is taking place in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people for thousands of years, and this land is subject to the peace and friendship treaties, the first of which was signed in 1725, and these treaties are the basis for peaceful coexistence and ongoing relations among all who live here and who come to study here. And I would like to acknowledge the contributions to Mi'kma'ki of African Nova Scotians whose presence here dates back to 1604. And before I introduce our speaker, I would like to call upon Michelle Mahoney, the Accessibility Officer at King's, to say a few words. And Michelle has been the heart of this lecture series and also instrumental every step of the way.
Thanks. Yeah, so it's our third public lecture. I don't know, this just keeps getting bigger and better, and I don't know how we're going to top this next year, Dorota. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I would like to tell you that we have washroom facilities, one floor up and one floor down. There is an elevator just outside this, either door. Also we do have 2 sensory rooms. I'm going to be sitting in the back row. If anybody needs to get away for a few minutes, I can take you there. But other than that, thank you all for coming. Thank you for whoever is here online. And this is going to be great. I'm looking so forward to your talk. Thank you.
And our esteemed guest tonight is Nicole Ineese-Nash, Anishinaabe educator, researcher, and community helper with over 15 years of experience working with Indigenous children, youth, and communities. And Professor Ineese-Nash is a member of Constance Lake First Nation in Treaty 9 territory, and she holds relation to the land, waters, and people along the English and Kabikagomi rivers. She's assistant professor in School of Early Childhood Studies and Child and Youth Care at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's executive director of Finding Our Power Together, which is a nonprofit that offers mental health coaching, group psychoeducation, and land-based cultural healing to Indigenous youth across Canada. And she's also a registered early childhood educator. And with a PhD in social justice education, a master's in early childhood studies, and that's in her own words, I'm honored to quote, she's passionate about supporting Indigenous self-determination and cultural resurgence, particularly in the context of childhood and youth. Professor Ineese-Nash has led innovative community-based research on the topics of Indigenous disability and early learning. And again, in her own words, her skills in community-based research, social justice, education, and Indigenous cultural practices have allowed her to work with Indigenous communities, both in and out of academy. And her research and work and practice is grounded in the relations with community and the relations with land in the context of Indigenous self-governance and Indigenous knowledge system. And one of her other projects is Land Forward, Designing for Future Relations. I've been looking forward to this lecture for months, so please help me welcome Professor Ineese-Nash.
English, thanks so much. I think my mics are working. I have multiple mics. Hi everyone. It's so great to be here. I'm really honored to have been invited to be a visitor here on this territory. It's my first time in Mi'kma'ki, and really honored to just be with you tonight and to share a little bit of what I've come to know about disability and Indigenous communities. In this presentation, I hope to offer a provocation, an invitation to think critically about disability, not as a particularly fixed or universal category, but as a culturally constructed concept that operates differently in various contexts. Too often, disability or disablement is framed as an individual impairment, as something located within someone's body or mind, rather than as a relational experience that is shaped by history, context, and culture. Through an engagement with Indigenous scholarship, community perspectives, and lived experiences, this talk will do 4 things. First, contextualize disabled Indigenous childhoods within the histories of colonialism and settler intervention. 2, to explore the Indigenous experiences of disability support systems, how they function and often fail Indigenous communities. Offer Indigenous teachings that expand our understanding of both disability, childhood, and the ways that we care for one another, and to provide recommendations for culturally responsive and self-determined approaches to supporting Indigenous children, youth, families, and community members with varying abilities. Miigwech, thank you so much, Dorota, for the lovely introduction. I will introduce myself a little bit more because I believe that who we are, where we come from, and the knowledge that we hold is important to how we approach this work. Nanabojo, Wache, Minogijigat, Zonje, Winishe, Wabagwanakwe, Nindishnakas, Mamamatwa, Minwa, Takarant, Nindonjaba, Makwa, Nindodem, Anishinaabe, Nindao. My name is Nicole Ineese-Nash. I also carry the name Zonje, Winishe, Wapakwanakwe, loosely translated into English that means strong, beautiful, wildflower woman. I am Anishinaabe, or Oji Cree, and my community comes from the place where the 3 rivers meet, also known as Mamamatawa, in Treaty 9 territory in northern Ontario. I also belong to the Indigenous community in Toronto, where I was born and raised and currently live and work. I won't talk more about my educational background, as you have that already, but I do want to say that both my academic and nonprofit work are really grounded in the need for Indigenous self-determination over systems that affect us, over the context in which we are forced to live, and ultimately, for our futures. For much of my life, I have been on a path of self-discovery, on a path of learning my culture, reconnecting with my knowledge systems, and understand what it means to be an Anishinaabe person within the confines of a settler colonial society. And so when I approach my work, I do so, yes, as an academic, yes, as a researcher, yes, as an educator, but I do so also as a community member, as an auntie, as a sister, and as a traditional helper. I have been privileged to be able to study alongside many mentors within the Academy. But even more so, what's been important to my own learning and understanding in terms of what I'm going to talk about today has been my apprenticeship with traditional Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders who have fundamentally shaped the way that I understand care, inclusion, and how to live well. And so I come here with all of those pieces of my understanding, that academic knowledge, that traditional knowledge, as well as my own lived experience. I identify as a cisgendered, able-bodied person, and I come to this work through a lifelong desire to want to support my own community, my own family. I have lived alongside mad and disabled communities my whole life, and have learned much about care, much about the systems that continue to pervade and ultimately subjugate many people on the margins of society. And I seek to come to this space in a good way, to offer what I've come to know, because I've been called to do so. And I hope what I have to offer today helps us in thinking critically about our world, how people are recognized, valued, and ultimately supported. So throughout this talk, one of the central arguments that I'm going to make, or that I hope to make, is that disablement as it occurs within a particular society occurs through the interaction between individual diversity and the context in which a person lives. Within the Canadian context, disability interacts with a distinct social system that is premised upon settler colonial hierarchical model, which disables along various matrices. I have been theorizing disability through Indigenous perspectives for many years, knowing that Indigenous and Western frameworks of disability do not align. They do not map onto one another nicely. They seemingly do not even speak the same language. In many Indigenous nations, ways of knowing and relating to diversity were not bound by colonial categorizations of ability. Our teachings, our histories, our stories talk about our kinship responsibilities as they shift through various stages in life and through various capacities. I hope to talk about that more in this talk later. There's a dissonance that exists between Indigenous and Western models of disability that we need to attend to, between the Indigenous understandings of body diversity and the settler colonial insistence on impairment as deficiency. This compels us to ask, what is disability? What is in fact disabling? And who gets to decide? If Indigenous nations did not name or frame disability as such prior to colonial contact, then disablement is not an inherent condition. It is contextual. It is constructed. It is shaped by the physical, political, and attitudinal landscapes in which it emerges. The very definitions of disability that now structure Indigenous disabled people's lives, legal definitions, diagnostic classifications, categories of eligibility and recognition, these are not neutral. They are colonial artifacts, mechanisms through which the settler state governs Indigenous bodies, determines whose needs are legitimate, and ultimately dictates who is worthy of care. If disability is contextual, then we must attend to the context. Colonialism has built the conditions in which Indigenous disability is produced and pathologized. It is the architect of the environments that render certain bodies unfit, the author of policies that declare certain minds unintelligible, that render enforcer of norms that fragment and isolate Indigenous people from their lands, from their kin, and from each other. The settler colonial state does not simply fail to recognize Indigenous understandings of disability, it manufactures its disablement. It disciplines it, and then it governs it. It imposes a particular framework and medicalized model of disability that does not serve Indigenous people, does not reflect Indigenous ways of knowing, and does not account for the relational systems of care that have long existed outside of settler law. As I've said, disability as it is currently structured within the settler, colonial, legal, medical, and bureaucratic framework is not merely a description of bodily or cognitive difference. It is a category of governance, a means by which the settler state determines who is capable of sovereignty, who is disposable, who is in need of control or intervention. Within the settler colonial world, disability has functioned as a mechanism of racial subjugation, entangled with the logics of land dispossession, enslavement, and anti-Blackness. Settler colonialism, particularly in the North American context, operates through a sophisticated and enduring triadic framework. As Eve Tuck and Wang Yang describe in their seminal work, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, the model outlines the intentional, pervasive, and profoundly damaging aspects of settler colonialism that affect all inhabitants of a settler state, albeit in vastly different capacities and with divergent consequences. At the heart of settler colonialism is the systemic dispossession and displacement of Indigenous populations. This process is not incidental, but is a primary aim of the colonial enterprise, meticulously designed to erase Indigenous histories and identities to clear the way for colonial expansion. I'm supposed to be teaching right now, so all my things are going off. Apologies, I'm going to turn that off. As scholars like Wolf have articulated, the logic of settler colonialism dictates the elimination of the native to assert the settlers' claims to permanence, fundamentally aiming to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. Settlers, as agents of colonial expansion, do not merely occupy but establish permanent residence, instituting new governance and economic systems that often reinforce narratives of racial and cultural superiority. These narratives are not benign, but serve to legitimize the ongoing occupation and exploitation of appropriated lands. Furthermore, the dynamics of settler colonialism in North America are intricately linked with the histories of enslaved Africans and their descendants, who were forcibly brought to work colonized lands. As scholars like Andrea Smith have argued, this group represents a fundamental yet disenfranchised labor force within the colonial economy. Despite their profound contributions to building colonial infrastructure, Black communities have been systematically denied any legitimate claim to land, embodying some of the most severe forms of dispossession and dehumanization in this country. This triadic model reveals the interconnectedness of dispossession among different marginalized groups, highlighting a shared, though distinct, history of exploitation and resistance. Recognizing these intersections is crucial for understanding the full scope of settler colonial's impacts and for forging pathways towards genuine decolonization. This is an ongoing and intentional framework, and this understanding is pivotal for any efforts aimed at decolonization. It is not enough to simply talk about Indigenous perspectives. We must actually remove the structures that harm them, remove the structures that continue to produce a particular way of knowing and being. And within the settler colonial enterprise, Indigenous Black people have always been positioned as disabled, as ineligible for sovereignty, as ineligible to be a part of the mainstream society. So within this structure, disability has been used as yet another justification for both Indigenous elimination and Black fungibility. Indigenous peoples have been marked as unfit for sovereignty, incapable of self-governance, and in need of legal and medical oversight. Black people are subjugated to violent logics of chattel slavery, were likewise classified as less than human, and their bodies positioned as tools of labor rather than as sovereign entities. Disability within the colonial context is not simply a neutral medical condition, it is a political designation, assigned to those who must be governed, managed, extracted from, and disposed of. This is why Indigenous and Black disability have been central to the governance of the settler state, because to mark a body as disabled is also to mark it as incapable of full political and economic participation, to position it outside of the structures that confer legal and social recognition. And I'd like to challenge us to think differently about how we understand disability, not only in this colonial framing of a categorization, but also as something that is an identity, as also as something as that is a relational experience. There are many ways that colonialism continues to produce disability in a particular way. And when I say disability in this context, I mean disablement. When we think about a social model of disability, we understand that diversity is a part of the human condition. Diversity is a natural occurring concept, a naturally occurring phenomenon. What makes diversity a disability is that interaction between an individual and the context in which they live. And when we understand the context, we recognize that settler colonialism has produced a context that continues to perpetuate a very normative standard for what a quote-unquote citizen should look like. And so there's this colonial construction of ability, of who is understood to be a citizen, who is understood to hold rights, who was understood to be able to produce within a particular society. When we think about our understandings of ability, we need to understand that this current configuration of society is not the only one that exists. Later in this talk, I'm going to talk more about Indigenous perspectives of ability and how in a different social structure, ability might be conceived in a different way. The colonial government also produces exclusion along various matrices. And I would say that governance model is not accidental. The settler governance model does not merely categorize disability, it subjugates it. The power to define who is disabled, who is able, is also the power to determine who is incapable of sovereignty, of rights, and who is deemed unfit for self-governance. If sovereignty, as the settler state defines it, is predicated on legal and political independence, then Indigenous and Black disability must be understood as forms of racialized incapacitation. Mechanisms through which the state justifies its authority over those deemed incapable of governing themselves. These are not accidental. These are embedded within the very foundations of settler governance. In Canada, for example, the Indian Act legally positioned Indigenous peoples as wards of the Crown, barring them from making independent legal, political, and financial decisions without state oversight. In the United States, the Dawes Act imposed competency tests that determined which Indigenous peoples were civilized enough to own land, while those deemed unfit had their land placed under federal trusteeship. This is not accidental. This is essential to the colonial project. And if we actually look even deeper, central to this colonial understanding is white supremacy, is the understanding that there are certain people who are more desirable citizens than others. Black people, too, have been systematically constructed as disabled through the logics of slavery, eugenics, and racial capitalism. Under racial capitalism, Blackness itself has been framed as a disabling condition, one that renders Black peoples non-human within the economic order. And this logic persists in contemporary carceral and medical systems, where Black and Indigenous peoples experience disproportionately high rates of incarceration, forced institutionalization, and medical neglect. Systems that continue to govern the boundaries of who is considered fully human, fully sovereign, and fully capable of self-determination. In this way, the colonial state has produced disability in particular ways. It is a deliberate structure of governance that disables Indigenous and Black communities through things like environmental violence, displacement, intergenerational trauma, and systemic neglect. Indigenous and Black peoples experience disproportionately high rates of disability. Yet these disabilities are often directly linked to colonial conditions. Things like poisoned water systems that lead to chronic illness, environmental dispossession that sever communities from traditional food systems and ways of life, medical neglect, which causes preventable impairments, intergenerational trauma, which then manifests as mental distress and is often diagnosed through Western psychiatric categories. I would say that many of what is considered to be a disability in these contexts is in fact a colonial inheritance. Yet settler governance does not simply disable the people, it then fails to care for them. Indigenous and Black communities remain underfunded for a variety of services, in particular disability services, and are disproportionately placed in settler-run institutions. The very structures that have produced disability then refuse to meet their needs and reinforce the idea that disability is a personal misfortune rather than a colonial condition or a collective responsibility. And yet, Indigenous and Black disability is not reducible to that colonial violence. We are not only survivors of harm, we are knowledge holders, leaders, kin, and sovereign people whose lives exceed the narrow settler definitions of dependency and dependency, I'll leave it there. The refusal to see our lifeways outside the narratives of suffering is itself a colonial erasure. one that ignores the ways that communities have always created systems of care and governance that do not rely on settler recognition. So I've been doing quite a lot of research in the past several years in thinking through and talking with Indigenous families, children, youth, communities, and elders. And in particular, thinking through what it means to be an Indigenous person within this context who has a disability. And so what's going to be shared in the next few slides is a representation of some of that knowledge. What we see is that there is a disproportionately high incidence of disability within Indigenous contexts. Indigenous children are 2 to 3 times more likely to be identified as having a disability or a special need than non-Indigenous children. Indigenous and Black children are significantly overrepresented in special needs, special education programs, and disability services, as well as many other social institutions, including child welfare. And so we see a disproportionate impact of disability within our contexts. What we also see is that the majority of diagnoses that Indigenous children have are largely related to behavioral and learning disabilities, disabilities that are highly subjective in nature in terms of how they are identified and diagnosed. There remains many barriers to accessing disability support. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the support service system as it's experienced by Indigenous families. But the barriers are immense, particularly when we think, sorry, I'm trying to find. Yeah, so there are significant disparities in terms of accessing care. And I've been critical of the care system, I've been critical of the settler colonial state, and I do this with the understanding that still we want care, still we want service, still we want to be able to access various institutions that we may benefit from. And when we do try to access those systems of care, we are met with various barriers, including the geographic and cultural disparities that currently exist. So for Indigenous children living in remote and rural parts of the country, basic services like speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioral supports, or even to be able to see a family doctor or get a diagnosis is often non-existent or is only available through a long wait list, an inconsistent fly-in or fly-out program. Jordan's principle has been a policy move that was meant to remedy some of these issues, but in practice, families still face significant barriers in navigating the bureaucratic processes, appealing denials, and securing funding for services that non-Indigenous children would normally just receive. Even when services are available, they are rarely culturally grounded or culturally safe. The interventions provided are typically Western, individualistic, and deficit-based, and are designed to correct impairments rather than support a child's full being. For many families, the most valuable supports that they receive are community-based supports, kinship-centered, culturally based, and embedded within Indigenous ways of knowing. But these are precisely the supports that are least likely to be funded, least likely to be recognized, and least likely to be integrated into official disability support programs. On the screen, there is a very difficult to decipher image, and this image represents one singular family's experience of navigating the disability support system. So as I said, I'm a co-investigator on a project called the Inclusive Early Childhood Service Systems Project. That's a mouthful, IECSS project. And we have been talking to families across Canada about their experience of accessing and navigating disability support services for their children. We started in the early years when children are about 2 or 3. That is generally a time at which developmental bells start going off for people to identify children. And we've been following them over the course of 9 years as they age into school-age programs. What we have found is that all children with disabilities are having a tough time, whether they are Indigenous or not. And in our study, we have about 1/3 of our participants are Indigenous from various communities across the country. We also have white families, affluent families, families who would by all means have a lot of access to support. And what we have found is that this system doesn't work for any of them. But what we can see is that the system is particularly complex for Black and Indigenous families, for families where a parent potentially has a disability, for families who have interactions with the social welfare system, and for families who have, for many reasons, a lack of access to the system, be it geographic or culturally reasons. What I want to highlight in this very complex system is that this system requires compliance. This system requires that a family accepts the diagnosis that they receive, that they believe the supports they are given are going to be useful, and that they participate in the labor of that system. You can't see what's happening on this slide, and all of these lines are depicting referrals, are depicting times at which potentially the parent had to make a referral, someone had to fill out a form, all of these kinds of things. And we actually have them categorized by different types of systems. So in the early years, people think there's early years services, education services exist over here, medical services exist over here, and all of these services don't necessarily talk to one another. So what we have found is that families are doing quite a bit of labor in order to make this system work. That labor requires that families, again, comply with that system, that they believe in that system, and ultimately that they follow through. So within this system, labels follow children through various social categories. We've been using a methodology called institutional ethnography, and the useful thing about an institutional ethnography approach is that we are not studying individual children. We are studying the system. And what we can tell you is that this system very much follows a medicalized model, very much follows a capitalist logic, and essentially commodifies care in particular ways that almost incentivize continued participation within it. We are not necessarily intervening in the lives of children for them to be well, for them to get better, for them to be corrected. We are ensuring that children continue to participate in that system. When families push back against the system, when they refuse to accept diagnosis that do not align with how they know their child, when they seek care outside of biomedical institutions, they are often met with suspicion, surveillance, and sometimes punishment. This system is not benevolent. It is high risk. It has an impact on not only the child, but also the family. And when we look to the commodification of disability, we see why. As I've stated, Indigenous children are massively overrepresented in various social systems, but in particular the child welfare system. They account for over half of all children in care, despite making up only 7% of the childhood population in Canada. And there are many reasons for this: poverty, systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, but disability is also playing a crucial role and is under-discussed. Many Indigenous families find themselves forced into impossible choices. At times, and what we have seen, is that many Indigenous families are being pressured to surrender their children, because that is the only way to actually get all of this to work. You actually need qualified personnel to coordinate all of this. And what we have found is that families that know the system well potentially stop going to work. This becomes their entire life, is coordinating this whole system. But they aren't paid to do that labor. And in fact, sometimes leaving their job puts them in a precarious situation for their child to be apprehended. But in many cases and in some jurisdictions, child welfare agencies are in fact the ones offering this type of service. And this makes it very high risk for families who are sometimes, like I said, getting pressured into surrendering their child in order to access essential services. Families are given various options to place their child in foster care, to place their child in unsafe environments, and ultimately to accept a diagnosis and to accept care that goes against their value systems, goes against what they actually want for their children, because they're afraid that if they resist, their child will be taken away. The child welfare system, in turn, has a vested interest in keeping children within its grasp. There are now specialized foster placements for children with disabilities, which receive additional funding. And this creates a perverse financial incentive to label Indigenous children as high needs and to maintain them within the system rather than reunify them with their families. The more complex a child's needs are perceived to be, the more valuable they become within the economy of the child welfare industry. This is not care. This is not protection. This is the commodification of disabled Indigenous children and the perpetuation of that settler colonial triad. I could say much more about this, but if others have questions during the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk more about the system itself. So I think fundamentally what needs to happen is for us to understand how we care well for one another, and for care to be the underlying framework for how we design our programs, our services, and our quote-unquote interventions. From an Indigenous perspective, we hold knowledge about how to care for one another well, how to care for one another in the context of our family, our community, our nation, and with all of creation. And so many of our creation stories tell us about how to live in good relation, how to be a good relative, how to live a good life. And this applies to how we understand children. And I want to offer a few of these points just so that we can compare this system, which looks like this, with an Indigenous understanding of what it means to care for a child well. There is an elder who has been working with us on this project, and one time we showed her one of these maps. And she said, the system is putting up all of these barriers and things to overcome. But the Indigenous way, if you were to put it right over top, would be a river. And an Indigenous way of understanding how to care for a child well is to let the river flow. That is not to say that we don't need intervention, that is not to say that we don't need support, but that fundamentally at our core, we understand the fluidity of development, the ebbs and flows. And to care for each other well is to be responsive to that fluid and variable development trajectory. Raising a child well from an Indigenous perspective is to understand that all children are a gift. They are not ours to own, to shape, or to mold, but they are a gift that we are entrusted with and accountable to. Children do not belong to individuals. They belong to the world, to their kin, to creation itself. Their existence is an offering. This is why in many Indigenous traditions, the birth of a child is not a private event. It is a communal celebration. It is a shift in the fabric of the world, a moment that demands attention, love, and a recognition that a new being has arrived with knowledge that we as adults do not yet hold. A child does not come into a family to be disciplined and or to be remade in the image of those who came before them. A child arrives with their own will, their own purpose, their own way of being in relation. The way that I've been taught is that all children come perfectly made, are a gift, and belong. There are teachings that tell us that children are the closest to the spirit world, that they have come from a place where knowing is deep and expansive, and where the boundaries between human and non-human, between past and future, between body and energy are not so rigid. This is why children see things we do not see, hear things we do not hear, speak to beings we've been told do not exist. And yet, instead of treating these ways of knowing with reverence, with curiosity, with the kind of tension that spirit deserves, too often the colonial world insists on disciplining them out of our children, of changing who they are fundamentally. To care for a child well is to refuse this erasure. It is to honor them, their entire spirit. In many Indigenous traditions, children are also understood as teachers. They carry the renewal of our communities. They carry the teachings of what is yet to come of this world, rather than what the world has been. But too often, colonial systems force children into silence, force them into rigid structures, where their intelligence is only recognized if it can be measured. To care for a child well is to listen, to allow them to lead, to teach, to reveal. Care in this sense is the practice of humility. It is a willingness to unlearn the arrogance that tells us that adulthood, that human adulthood, is the peak of knowledge, that we are here to teach them rather than to be taught. It's the ability to see children not as blank slates to be filled, but as beings that are already filled with knowledge and we would do well to learn from. Caring for a child also is a communal responsibility, one that insists that children are full sovereign beings. Indigenous nations have always known that children are already whole, already sovereign, already part of the community. Children are not just the future, they are the present. They are already decision makers, knowledge keepers, and culture holders now. And so the distinction between a child and an adult is only that they're at a different point within the circle. To care for a child well is to recognize that agency, to give them a voice in the decisions that shape their lives, and to protect their right to speak on behalf of their own well-being. Ultimately, caring for children well, and why I really like focusing on children and youth, is because caring for our children is how we ensure the survival of our nations, of our cultures, of our ways of being. It's how we protect our ways of life. And it's important that we raise children well so that we protect not only their bodies, but also their spirit. And in many of the social systems that children are interacting with, that spiritual element is either lacking or is actually purposefully subdued. So I want to stop here for a moment and to offer a potential otherwise, a potential way of thinking about difference, disability, and care that might exist if our societal structure was not structured in this way. The dominant Western model insists that disability, disablement, is something that is to be fixed or measured or mourned. It insists that it's an individual condition, a deviation from a constructed normality. But for many Indigenous nations, disability has not existed as such. Instead, difference has been understood as part of the human experience, as something that is relational, as something that does not diminish one's place in the community, but potentially changes it or shifts it. When we talk about Indigenous conceptualizations of disability, we are not just talking about different ways of framing impairment. We are talking about different worlds, different epistemologies, different ways of organizing relationships and care. And we are talking about the violence of having those ways disrupted, erased, and replaced with settler models of care that are invested in control, in conformity, and in the pathologization of difference. In my work with families and communities, I've witnessed the deep knowledge that exists within our communities around disability and care and interdependence. I have seen families who reject the language of burden or dependence because they've always lived in a way that understands care as reciprocal, as fluid, as adaptive. I have listened to elders who describe children with disabilities as gifts, as knowledge holders, as teachers, and simply as people who move through the world in a way that teaches the rest of us something that we would otherwise fail to see. I have also seen what happens when these worldviews come into contact with colonial structures that insist on individualization, that demand productivity, that reduce a person's worth to their ability to overcome their differences, and in particular, in ways that are legible to the state. I have seen the exhaustion, the grief, the frustration of families who are forced to navigate systems that refuse to recognize the strengths and gifts of their children and instead insist on treating them as deficits to be managed. I've seen what can also happen when we bring disability positive and Indigenous positive understandings together. I want us to think differently about disability beyond the constraints of settler colonial frameworks and to think what might it mean to center Indigenous understandings of care, relationship, and belonging. So many Indigenous communities, particularly elders, will say that traditionally disability did not exist as such. This is not to say that human variation did not exist. That is not to over-romanticize pre-colonial Indigenous societies, to suggest that discrimination or exclusion did not happen. I'm sure it did. But generally speaking, human variation was not something that was diagnosed, categorized, and not always in need of reparation. Instead, difference was understood through the lens of relationality, through the roles that we hold within our community. And that was shaped not by an external standard of ability, but by one's relationships, how we exist in relation to those around us. The imposition of a medical model redefined what it meant to be disabled, transforming a natural human variation into something that needed intervention. We see so many colonial institutions that have ultimately been framed around the same thing, that Indigenous peoples, that disabled peoples, that people who are not part of the settler category need to be assimilated into it. And today we see the continued dominance of the Western deficit-based models in almost every social system. In disability, this insists that disability is a personal tragedy rather than a relational experience that shifts or transforms in different contexts. Indigenous peoples have never stopped practicing their own ways of knowing disability. In particular, that we understand that each individual is a sacred gift to creation. And when I say that, I mean this literally. That we believe that each individual spirit that comes to this earth at this time comes with a purpose, comes to a family in which they belong, comes to this world at this particular time for a reason. And when differences exist, when there is diversity in how an individual comes to the world, that we see that as a gift too. That we recognize there is something to be learned from each person who comes to our community. And what is sometimes considered to be a disability in this Western dominant framing would often be considered a spiritual gift from an Indigenous perspective. We also understand that those gifts, that those needs, that the ways that people show up to the world are contextually based. So in one context, we might be disabled from participation, while in another, we might be able to thrive. And that interaction between individuality and the environment was really important to Indigenous considerations. We understand a collective orientation in how we work within our communities. And what that means is that there is already a basis for inclusion. When we live in communities in which we are all kin, when we are all related, it's very difficult to exclude someone on the basis of diversity or difference, unless that person may potentially impede on our way of life. But the basis of all of our communities is that we are all related, that we are all kin. When I introduced myself today, I started with the word nanabojo. Have people heard that word before? So it's an Ojibwe or Anishinaabe-Moan word, and nanabojo is often used as a greeting. You say nanabojo, but it doesn't mean hello. It means I recognize you as a descendant of nanabojo, which in Anishinaabe creation stories is our original being. So when I say nanabojo, I say I recognize you as a descendant of the original being. I recognize you as a descendant of that being. I recognize you as that descendant of that being. And why I'm doing that is that I recognize me as a descendant of that being. Therefore, we are all related. We are all kin. So exclusion did happen, but it was very uncommon. We understood that natural human diversity was a part of the gift of life, that it taught us something, and that we needed difference. We needed diversity in order for a collective survival, in order for us all to thrive. This holistic worldview allowed us to honor various abilities, to honor various dimensions, and to recognize that everybody has a purpose within the community. There is not one standard ideal citizen, that everyone has a role to play. So to talk about decolonizing disability, we must think through what that might look like. We must begin with a refusal of the narratives that frame Indigenous disability solely as suffering, as tragedy, as something to be overcome. Eve Tuck reminds us that the violence of damage-centered narratives, those that insist on defining Indigenous lives, Indigenous bodies, Indigenous futures only through the lens of harm. To decolonize disability is to refuse this framing. It is to insist on a desire-based approach, one that does not erase oppression, but centers the agency, brilliance, and possibility of Indigenous disabled people. So rather than asking how can we fix the broken systems that continue to fail Indigenous disabled people, I think we must ask instead, how does Indigenous disability justice look like when it is led by Indigenous disabled people? What knowledge already exists within our communities about how to care for one another well? And what might it mean to build a world where Indigenous disability was not only recognized, but actually valued, integrated, and nurtured? These are the questions that are at the heart of Indigenous disability justice, an approach that brings together Indigenous relational worldviews and disability justice frameworks that have been articulated by disabled activists of color who insist that disability justice must be anti-colonial, must be intersectional, and must be centered on the most marginalized. I believe within the settler colonial context, Indigenous and Black disabled people are those that are most marginalized and those that hold the most extensive knowledge on how to fix that system. From an Indigenous perspective, I think disability justice offers us much to think about in terms of how we reframe our worlds. In particular, from an Indigenous perspective, we deserve and we desire sovereignty over our own bodies and our care. Western medicine and disability services have long been tools of colonial control. From the forced sterilization of Indigenous disabled people to the medical kidnapping of Indigenous children with disabilities, the state has repeatedly asserted power over Indigenous bodies and ways of life. Indigenous disability justice demands the return of that sovereignty. It asserts that Indigenous disabled peoples have the right to define their own experiences and needs, to access care that is culturally grounded and self-determined, to reject harmful interventions that do not align with their ways of knowing and being. In practice, this means shifting from the state-controlled disability service model to community-led models of care, models that honor Indigenous ways of healing, that offer culturally based support systems, and the autonomy of disabled people in choosing how they receive care. Patty Byrne reminds us that independence is a myth, a capitalist, ableist idea that tells us that survival must be individual rather than collective. Indigenous knowledge has always recognized that interdependence is not a weakness. It is how we survive, and ultimately how we thrive. There are many teachings that tell us about the balance that exists between all aspects of ourselves, that reinforce that healing is never an individual process. In many of our nations, we understand that individual health and well-being is tied to the health and well-being of our communities, and ultimately to our earth, to our world, to all of creation. Indigenous disability justice is an assertion that we do not have to prove our worth through individual productivity or well-being, that our value is inherent, and that our survival is collective. Ultimately, also, that these systems of subjugation must also attend to how we care for our world. Mia Mingus describes ableism as a system that values bodies and minds based on their ability to produce within capitalism. The system tells us that disability is only acceptable if it can be mitigated, rehabilitated, or made, quote unquote, useful. It demands that disabled people either overcome their disabilities or disappear altogether. An Indigenous disability justice framework refuses both of these options. Instead, it asserts that Indigenous disabled people do not have to prove their worth in order to be cared for, that disability is not something to be overcome, but a valid way of being in the world, that healing is not just about making people more functional in a settler sense. It is about creating conditions where people can live well, however that looks for them. Many Indigenous families experience disability services not as sources of support, but as sites of surveillance, forced intervention, and state control. Indigenous parents report reluctance to seek out disability support because of the high risk of child apprehension and for the lack of compatibility between those systems and their own worldview. In my work with Indigenous youth, I've also been talking a lot to young people about how they identify as disabled or as MAD, and how those interactions within the support system are going for them. Indigenous young people navigating mental health supports often experience racialized pathologization. Their trauma is labeled as something to be mitigated, as something to be changed. Just change your thoughts. Colonialism isn't something we can just think away. It is something that is enduring and continues to exist. It is traumatic. We know that we are overrepresented in all of these institutional settings: prisons, psychiatric facilities, foster care, and more. And we are subject to extreme violence and neglect within these contexts. Decolonizing disability means creating Indigenous-led alternatives, spaces where disabled Indigenous people do not have to fight for recognition, where care is embedded in kinship, and where the goal is not just survival but thriving, where Indigenous disabled people are leading the way. Settler colonialism positions Indigenous people as already damaged. It defines Indigenous future through a deficit model, one that assumes that Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous disabled people, can only ever hope for inclusion, for intervention, or for charity. But Indigenous disability justice refuses to be framed only through this damage. It is not simply about fighting against oppression. It is about building futures that disabled Indigenous people dream of for themselves. A desire-based approach asks us to think critically. What are Indigenous disabled people already creating for themselves and each other? What possibilities emerge when we shift from fighting for access into colonial systems and build our own worlds instead? What does freedom look like when we imagine disability not as something to be accommodated, but as something that structures how we relate to each other? This is not a metaphor. This is a reclamation, an insistence that disability is not just an identity, but a site of power, of knowledge, of sovereignty. It is a refusal to wait for the settler state to recognize our humanity, and a commitment to creating spaces where that humanity is already known, already celebrated. Indigenous disabled people are not waiting around for justice. They are already building it. The task before us is to listen, to follow, and to ensure that every future we imagine is one where they are not just included, but leading the way. We have spent some time tracing the colonial construction of disability. The ways Indigenous childhoods have been shaped by the systems of control and the alternative possibilities that exist within Indigenous worldviews. But what comes next? How do we move from critique to transformation? Oftentimes I end these talks with a list of recommendations, and I thought perhaps that's not the way to go. Eve Tucker reminds us that settler colonialism locks Indigenous peoples into narratives of damage, defining us through the violence that we have endured. Instead of focusing only on what that damage, can we attend to the harm while also desiring for something else? It is not enough to just document and talk about oppression and violence. We must also dream, build, and enact alternatives in the now. So rather than asking how we might make colonial institutions more accommodating, more inclusive, more humane, I want to ask different kinds of questions. Questions that unsettle. Questions that invite us to imagine beyond what we've been told is possible. Questions that do not seek easy answers, but instead open up space for the futures Indigenous disabled people are already interested in creating. Western frameworks teach us to see disability as a limitation. We are asked to measure disabled lives in terms of what they cannot do, what they must overcome, how they must be made more functional in a world built for able-bodied and neurotypical people, in a world built for non-Indigenous people. But Indigenous worldviews tell us something else. What if disability was not framed through deficit, but through wisdom? What if Indigenous disabled people were recognized as knowledge holders, as people whose ways of moving and being in the world and being in relationship reveal truths that able-bodied society has forgotten or cannot know? For many Indigenous nations, those with disabilities have historically held important roles as dreamers, as visionary, as lodge carriers, as people whose ways of experiencing the world bring insights that others might not have. But these roles have been disrupted, erased, and made invisible by colonial institutions that treat disability only as a site of suffering. What would change if we reclaimed these understandings? If we stopped trying to force Indigenous disabled people into systems that see them as incomplete, and instead recognize them as carrying vital knowledge about how to live, how to relate, and how to be in the world? What if accessibility was not an individual right, but a collective responsibility? Too many Indigenous disabled children grow up in systems that tell them that they are a burden, that they are too much, that they must work harder to reach a normative standard. They encounter schools that isolate them, medical institutions that pathologize them, child welfare systems that separate them from their families, all in the name of care. But what if instead every Indigenous person grew up knowing that they were sacred? What if they were never told they had to prove their worth? What if their needs were not seen as exceptional, but simply as part of the vast diversity of human experience? What if we built communities where Indigenous disabled children did not have to fight for their recognition because they were already known, already valued, and already fully cared for? When we talk about sovereignty, we often talk about land, about governance, and about nationhood, about reclaiming jurisdictions over our own futures. But sovereignty must also mean sovereignty of our bodies, of our ways of being, our definitions of health and wellness. What if Indigenous sovereignty included the full sovereignty of disabled Indigenous people, their right to define their own experiences, to access care in ways that reflect their cultures, both as Indigenous and disabled people, to live without constant threat of institutionalization, surveillance, or forced intervention? What if disability services were not structured around colonial policies that demand proof of suffering, but instead were built around the inherent recognition that all people are deserving of care, and in particular, that Indigenous people are integral to our nations, our governance systems, and our futures? These are not abstract questions. They are already being answered by Indigenous disabled people, by families who refuse the logics of harm, by communities who are creating their own models of care, access, and disability justice, all of which can exist outside of state control. Indigenous disability justice is not just a vision for the future, it's already happening today. It is happening in the families who refuse to surrender their children to colonial institutions, in the disability activists who are asserting their place in Indigenous nationhood, in the youth who are rejecting ableist definitions of success and creating new models of how to identify. The real question is not whether justice is possible. The real question is whether we are willing to follow the leadership of Indigenous disabled people who have never stopped fighting for themselves. Will we continue to ask how to make settler systems slightly less harmful, or will we commit to building something different entirely? Because Indigenous disability justice is not about survival, it's about living well, it's about thriving, and it's about refusing the containment that has been put upon us and insisting on worlds that honor all of us, exactly as we are. I hope you will join me in building this future.
Nicole, for these incredible, powerful, and transformative teachings. Thank you so much. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions, if you are willing.
Yeah.
Okay. And we have one or two microphones that go around. May both.
I don't like you first. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. I just want to thank Mr. Dawa for inviting me on the Halifax Humanities current session. This is my first in person. I've done it online, so thank you for the options because it works. Nicole, thank you for coming. I don't want to sound naive. I do have a brain injury, so sometimes it takes me twice around the very bush to be prepared. So what I want to say is, in the conversation, unfortunately, I'm limited by colonial language. I see an experience, I was trying to do the math in my head, it was about 20 years ago, I did some work in the public housing systems here, mostly black families that were being overdiagnosed ADD and ADHD. Due to a very lovely doctor, Dr. Erica Baker, she generously offered half a day to show what ADD and ADHD really was. We've seen a pattern of, and I'm hearing the exact same 20 years that has not changed.
For the interpreter, can you just slow a little bit?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm also Scottish and talk fast, especially more passionate, right?
Thank you very much.
Does it help if I take my mask down? It's a your thing, okay. All right, thank you. So one of the things I noticed is the majority of the families that were there, one thing they had in common, and there was a mixture of families, is poverty. It was just, poverty was, and that was the difference Dr. Erica Baker offered her time because the given assessment was $2,000. A lot of these families were being threatened bring your child to school unless you're medicated. You get 2 warnings or you bring your child home early. And this was 20 years ago, and I was really hoping to see some change. I know I'm hopelessly hopeful. With the risk of sounding incolonial, is there a space, or maybe there's an equivalent, maybe there's an Indigenous equivalent? We desperately need a guardian ad litem. We need children to have their own legal representation. We know, and that's not just saying parents don't do a good job, but we know when we've had parents who've had 2 to 4 children in the system, if the first child is labeled, they all get labeled. Your family's labeled. Oh, those parents are so defensive, you can't talk any sense to that. There's a desperate need for that role of guardian ad litem or the Indigenous equivalent. Is there any room for that in that conversation that we're having here? Because children do, first of all, it gives the parents a break. Over-aroused, that constant fight all the time for everything is your diagram, that chaotic diagram showing a fight every time you walk out your door. So does that make sense, my question? Is there a space in a discussion on that, like the equivalent of guardian ad litem? Children need to have their own representation because they're just getting swallowed up, as you know.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that you said there that I can attend to. One is around diagnosis and assessment. So I'm critical of diagnosis and assessment, and it's a useful tool. It's one of the tools we have in our bundle, in our toolbox. I think what happens is that the system, that crazy diagram, hinges upon assessment, hinges upon diagnosis. And diagnosis becomes a gatekeeper in terms of that system opening up for families. So I think assessment is helpful, and I think getting children assessed can be useful, particularly I think, that it is a gatekeeper to the system. We are seeing overdiagnosis because it is required. It's required by the state. And so that's the argument I'm trying to make, is that the colonial way that we have categorized disability has relied upon these eligibility criterias rather than seeing disability as something that is naturally occurring, that is going to happen, that likely exist in every space that we walk into, and instead of relying only upon these gatekeeper pieces, that we could attend to disability in different ways. Like, do we need a disability for a child to get support? Like, do we need that assessment? It might help, but it shouldn't be required. The other piece that you were saying around poverty and kind of like socioeconomic status and those kind of factors, I think that's a huge part of the conversation that is often lacking. We hear a lot from practitioners who are like, oh, that family's in denial, they're neglecting their child, they're not getting the child support. But even the most affluent families are still not getting good support. So is it denial or is it refusal? And I think the pieces around poverty, trauma, systemic barriers all need to be a part of the conversation as well, because I think wellness, living well, requires that all of our needs are met. And of course, disability is going to be further a condition of marginalization if those other pieces are not attended to. I don't know if I answered that question, but it's sometimes disheartening to hear, 20 years ago I heard the same thing.
I apologize.
Okay, so I have about the same brain motor skill, apraxia moment sometimes too, and I've been trying to stay with it, so bear with me. This year I am investigating a lot about, actually this book here, White Benevolence, for me has been just the base of my advocacy this year. I've been a disabilities advocate for the last 3 years, also a self-advocate. So the Nova Scotia system, social care system, is mind-blowing as to how very rigidly colonial it truly is. And the one thing that I'm challenged with this year is that I've ran out of euphemisms to present, especially to white feminist social workers that believe action. And right now, I'm kind of at a loss because everything that I've investigated for the last couple of years is how much there's such a stronghold on Indigenous people, Black people, disabled people. We could go on, right? And so I'm trying to kind of approach the government, like the social care system. Social care organizations are funded under a for-profit business model, and that is just tragedy because people are just constantly underserved. It's paternalistic, not only too, like it's opportunistic because it's numbers, right? Like how many people did we serve? But did you really serve them? Who was served in this framework? And the other thing too that I'm also noticing on paternalism is how much, what is individualized funding, right? Like we do not have our own agency to ask for our own ability to fund ourselves. Instead, we have to go to a middleman and disclose so much confidential information about ourselves that could put us in a situation that if the other person has like really strong, their own strong ideology, personal ideology, it's like it's so dangerous for people here to try to access care. And so I don't know what to do next, like to kind of to explain to white feminists that you're on the wrong side most of the time. Like how do you do that without being rude, without being blacklisted from highlighting those points?
Be rude.
Be rude, I know. And you know, like a couple of weeks ago I attended like, I think it's like 5 poets breaking into song with George Eliot Clark. And the one thing he said towards the end, I love that, like disrupt the liars. And it is even like, and that's the thing, I find it's the hardest task because I'm still in a precarious situation in my life. I am not feeling secure. And it's because I know the solutions to my problems, but I am like on this like campaign, like and that whole graph that you showed, like all the lines and zigzags, I am familiar with that. And it's bullshit. You know, and it makes me angry to think about those things. And also too, like we are at a spectrum of barriers, right? I'm from the marginalized barrier category, but not in the same way as others, right? Like we know, but again, like I'm not putting myself in line from a settler status with Indigenous, oh yeah, we're going through the same thing. No, just making sure that's how. But I don't know how to do this next without putting myself in danger. But sometimes the narrative, like the gatekeepers know they're the gatekeepers. And how do you, like again, I'm just frustrated and I'm just looking for insight.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear you. I don't have insight on how to talk to white people because I just don't care. I will say, but what I can say is what you're describing is how these colonial systems impact everybody. And that's the part that needs to, I think, become part of the conversation. When we're talking about decolonization, it's not an only Indigenous person or Indigenous community issue. This is a Canadian issue. We all live within the settler colonial context. And the way that this has been developed puts us in social hierarchies. So even in that settler category, there is diversity in terms of who has that social capital. And that's the piece that I would suggest for people in terms of particularly trying to dismantle white supremacy. Like, these systems are fundamentally upheld through our interaction with them. The savior, the charitable model, that's all upholding this system and stratifying individual people into particular categories. And so that's the decolonization work that I think needs to happen more broadly. How you get there, I think, is about finding your own people and being okay with like giving less shits about what people think, about what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I know, but it's just like at the same time too, it's like you get blacklisted, right? Like you cannot participate anymore. You are blocked, and it's just like trying to figure out how to not get blocked in the process of really speaking the truth, right? So, and then the other thing as well, it's like we're all here now with the recent happenings in the States where we're like shining our nails. Oh yeah, us Canadians, we're like diversity-loving people. But we, again,
Miigwech, thank you so much.
Well, from Saskatchewan, I'm 80. I'm also, I've got disabled people just about every level of my family. And one of my goals in life is to kind of get fluent in my language, go back home and be a teacher. And I'm kind of wondering how I enter a very, very colonial education system and sort of try to equalize things a little bit, in the classroom going forward. Just wondering if you had like insights on that.
Like as a student or as a teacher?
As a teacher.
I could talk about this for a long time, but I think something that sometimes in my talks, people are like, well, this is not really practical. Like, what do I actually do in the classroom? What do I do with children? And I think if you have an understanding of welcoming diversity into your classroom, you develop technologies to adapt to the individual needs of the children in your classroom. When I was talking about the colonial context, the systems that we have do not meet the needs of the people within the system. They meet the needs of the system themselves. So why I'm saying that is that individualized care in a classroom environment, let's say, is not very possible when you have such large classrooms, when there's lack of funding for supportive equipment or support staff, where you're constantly facing barriers with administration to advocate for your students. And then I've talked to teachers who get mad at me for suggesting that they do anything differently. And I totally hear them, that it's very difficult to do in a classroom context to attend to each individual child. Very difficult, not impossible. And that's where advocacy, I think, can play a role in terms of how you start to structure your environments to be disability positive environments. Small changes over time can produce significant differences in the ways that children can interact with a particular space. Having a sensory-friendly environment, having an environment that really talks about access needs in the context of children. Children know what they need to the most part. They might need language, they might need mentorship to actually be able to articulate that. But in a lot of cases, you get to know what they need. And are you able to provide it? Are you able to structure the entire environment to meet the child of those who are most impacted? And that's the part that our systems don't do. They create the system for the majority, the neurotypical, the able-bodied, because those are the largest numbers. But what we should actually be doing is organizing the environment over the person who's going to be most impacted if it's inaccessible. And usually, if we do that, all of the other children also benefit. So I don't know that I've actually answered your question, but I don't envy teachers. I think it's difficult to do, but it's a structural piece. Like it's not on individuals. It needs to be a collective understanding that we need to attend to diversity from the outset as opposed to accommodating it later. Miigwech for your question.
Impossibly enough, unless there's a very quick last question. Okay, if I could, first of all, thank you immensely for that talk, for the discussion. Thank you very much. Sorry, trying to access. Which I can't. I wanted to invite you to the other events in the lecture series, which was supposed to pop up on the screen, but they are not. So please look out for our posters and so forth. We will have a film screening on March 11 and then another lecture on March 18. But before we disperse, we will have a reception in honor of Professor Ineese-Nash. So please join us on the second floor of this building. This is a wonderful opportunity to get to know you, ask another question, and celebrate you. So please join us. And once again, thank you so very much.
Thank you.